This week on Called to Serve, we have someone who's very used to telling their story of how they were called to talk about vocations, because we'll be talking to the Vocations Director for the Diocese of Baton Rouge, Father Matt Dupre, and we'll be hearing his story of how God led him here and how he was called to serve. Show Called to Serve. Today we're very fortunate because we're with a very busy young man who's working here in the diocese, who's both working at a parish, in ministry, and a full-time vocations director in the diocese. So he's able to take time out of his busy schedule to come and share with us his vocation story. We want to welcome Father Matt Dupre. Welcome, Father Matt.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We're here today talking about how you were called to serve and how God brought you to the place where you fully understood that God was calling you into his ministry. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what led you here?
Okay, well, I think my vocation story is not unlike many other vocation stories. It began for me as a young child. Of course, I had the great privilege of growing up in a wonderful Catholic household. I'm the youngest of 9 children, and it was wonderful to have the presence of 2 loving parents and wonderful brothers and sisters who, in some way, helped to foster my love for God and for the church. And also, growing up, I had the opportunity of attending Catholic schools from kindergarten all the way through high school. So I began at St. Elizabeth School in Pankerville. And I can remember as a very young child being, in some mysterious way, attracted to what the priest did at the Mass. And I would oftentimes come home and begin to mimic what the priest did at Mass. I would play church. I would invite my sisters, or sometimes even force my sisters to dress up in their nightgowns to be my altar servers, and I would pretend to celebrate Mass and would read my prayers for my little children's prayer book. And they would sit attentively and listen and participate. So I think even from a very early age, God was instilling within my own heart the potential to serve God and the church as a priest. Of course, as a young child, I grew up on a sugarcane farm, and so I had many interests and many things that I thought maybe I could in fact do with my life. One thing that I will always remember, though, that as a young child, maybe around the year when I was 4 or 5 years old, I was at a rehearsal supper for one of my brothers who was getting married, and I was in some way I think seated next to the priest who would be performing the wedding. And I think the conversation came up how I was pretending to be a priest at home, celebrating Mass in the living room, and the priest turned to me and with great sincerity said, well, maybe one day you might be a priest. And even from the age of 4 or 5 years old, I remember that to this day. It's a very vivid memory for me. And so as I went through elementary school, again, being exposed to the teachings of the church, to having the opportunity to pray in school and to read Scripture, celebrating Mass, not just on Sundays, but with the school community as St. Elizabeth, and having a priest who really was very much involved in the life and the community of the school. That priesthood always, I think, in my heart and mind, remained an option for me in my life. And I would occasionally through my childhood and elementary school, I would in some way see myself as potentially doing what the priest was doing at Mass. Now, of course, my understanding of what priesthood was and what priests really did was, I think, limited to what I saw them doing both in the school as, like visiting classes and talking about Jesus and God and the teachings of the church, as well as what they did at Mass on Sundays. It was limited in my understanding. But yet, in some way, I think God was working very mysteriously in my heart and in my mind. In high school, I think I lived very much a typical teenage high school experience. When I was a junior in high school, I went to Ascension Catholic High School in Donaldsonville. And when I was a junior, I began to realize that many of my peers were making decisions about what the future might look for them. Mm-hmm. And so I began to feel compelled to really begin to seriously take a look at what my future might look like as well. And as a junior in high school, again, priesthood was an option for me. And the pastor that I had at the time, Father Jeff Bahi, encouraged me to talk to the vocation director. And I did. I began a conversation with the vocation director, who was Father Donald Blanchard at the time. And he was very open, surprisingly, to a very young man. I'm sure I was very naive at the time, but he was very open and invited me to have a conversation with him. And he took me very seriously where I was, and would invite me to go to the seminary, to make visits to the seminary, and so I really began to seriously discern the call to priesthood in high school, in the latter part of my high school years.
If I may interrupt just for
Sure.
a moment, I'm very happy to hear that, because I know that in more our generation, where there's not so much high school seminary or even college seminary going on, it's very difficult sometimes for young men who are very young to really be taken seriously.
Yes.
When they're looking at the priesthood, because a lot of times it's like, well, you'll grow out of it, or contact us when you're graduated from college,
Right.
it's too early
Yes.
now. And so to hear that actually encourages me, because I actually know of some young men who, had they been taken a little more seriously when they were younger, later on they sort of lost interest because nobody ever really gave them the chance, because
Correct.
we don't do that with young kids anymore.
Right.
And so I'm glad to hear that there was that openness, because
Yes.
God can call us when we're 20, but he can also call us when we're 10.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm so happy to hear that the diocese was open to the fact that a young man might very early on already be led by the Holy Spirit in that direction, and
Yes.
how insightful and wise of them to allow that to really flourish.
Yes, and in hindsight, I really am very thankful that Father Blanchard did at that time, I think, take me quite seriously. And I will admit, I was very naive, and I really didn't fully understand what one's call or what one's vocation to the priesthood really meant. I just knew that something was in my heart, and I think he really, through our conversation, in some way took it rather seriously. And in fact, when I was a senior in high school, Father Blanchard provided me an opportunity to apply for the seminary. Now, upon receiving the application for the seminary, I took that home with me, and I really began to, I think maybe for the first time, really began to pray about what that would mean for me in my life. And I wasn't, at that particular point in my life, quite ready to fully and wholeheartedly embrace all the implications that would mean for me. And so I put the application away, And I began to focus my attention in other directions or in other ways. And I decided to go to college and not to the seminary. So I went to Loyola University in New Orleans, where actually I was studying, I began to study accounting. But while I was in New Orleans, the call to priesthood remained. And I began to attend daily Mass. I began to help out at the chapel at Loyola in New Orleans. And I began to attend vocation retreats where I had the opportunity to go without really telling anybody. I just needed to figure it out on my own. And I started to go to vocation retreats and there really to open up my heart and to listen to what God was asking of me and to be able to ask questions about what priesthood really meant. Because at that time, of course, I knew that it meant much more than just celebrating the Mass on Sundays or a daily Mass or a funeral or a wedding. And so on one of those retreats, I came into contact with Father Frank Uter, who was sort of the associate vocation director at the time as well. And we began a wonderful dialogue, and he really helped me in my second year of college to begin to see that it was worthwhile giving seminary a shot. And so I began the process yet again. I went and began to visit with Father Blanchard again, and again he was very open. And when I received that same application again from him about applying to the seminary and becoming a seminarian, I was able to take that with me, and I was able to not only fill it out, but I filled it out with great anticipation and joy and a certain enthusiasm, and I think a fuller understanding of what it was I was actually doing at that particular point in my life. And so before I knew it, I was going through the process of being accepted as a seminarian. And I was accepted as a seminarian, and I found that before I knew it, I was enrolled at St. Joseph's Seminary College. And so God, yes, was I think working the whole way through, and allowing me to see that once called to the priesthood, really needed on my own part. Also, just I think a full assent of both the will and the heart.
Well, that's good, because obviously through your whole life there were signs, there were flashes, it was in the peripheral, but once you started to focus, you got a little nervous.
Yes.
How committed am I to this? How far
Correct.
do I want to go in this? And so that's really a lot of what we talk about on this show is really that process of, okay, it's a suggestion, it's something that's there, it's something gnawing in the back of my mind to, am I really going to say yes to this? Am I really going to commit to this? Am I willing to even take the first step? And of course, some run, some embrace it wholeheartedly, and there's a lot in between. And so clearly you were in that area of, I want to have my eyes wide open, but I also want to make sure that I'm faithful to, if God is calling me, that I don't run away from that.
Exactly.
So that's exciting. We're going to be right back with Father Matt Dupre in a moment, and he's going to continue to tell us about his formation experience and how God brought him through that important discernment. We'll be right back.
Do you need a little light in your life? Tune in to the next episode of Beacons of Light, where we'll share the story of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in action, serving God's poor and homeless. We'll share stories of our volunteers and our supporters, making the gospel come to life for those in need.
God's way is my way, God's shield is around.
Welcome back to Called to Serve. We're here with Father Matt Dupre, and he's telling us the story of how as a very young man he was already feeling the tug towards the priesthood, but how little by little he began to really make that decision. Now, when we left, you were just starting to enter into formation, and you were entering into the college seminary, and I know that then things get really serious. Now you're entering into the discipline of daily prayer. Now you're entering into the community of these men that are doing this discernment process with you. How did that process work for you as you were really beginning to go through this very intense formation time now?
Okay, once I was accepted as a seminarian for the Diocese of Baton Rouge, and I began to make known to family and friends the fact that I would be beginning my journey at the seminary, at St. Joseph's Seminary College, and I began to take ownership of it. I could say when I first moved into St. Joseph's Seminary College, when I first arrived and began to unpack my bags and to just settle into my room and begin to get into the routine of being a seminarian, of being in seminary, prayer, work, study, fun, that there was just a tremendous peace that in some way I knew that was where I needed to be. And of course, the seminary is the time where you take care of all the academic work, but at the same time, it's paralleled with you continuing to seriously ask yourself about that call to serve God as a priest. I can remember, that first application I received from Father Blanchard in high school. The first question was, why do you want to become a priest? And it was the same first question. The second time I took the step to apply for the seminary. And while I felt I was able to answer that question on the application, seminary really helped me to discover that particular reason of why I thought God was calling me to be a priest and what it meant to be a priest of God, to be a priest of Jesus Christ, to be a priest of the church. And so it was really a wonderful journey. It was challenging because, of course, in the seminary, they want you to grow. They want you to not only grow intellectually, but also spiritually, and to see and to really take full ownership of the fact that God doesn't want just you to serve, but He wants all of you to serve with a very generous heart, with a very loving heart. And so in the seminary, I really began to discover who I was, and I began to discover who Jesus was for me. And it was through that whole process, that whole discernment and formation process in the seminary, where the more I learned about God, the more I learned about Jesus, His Son, the more I learned about Christ, the more the church, the more I fell in love with all aspects of it. And also at the same time, just falling in love with myself, in the sense that I began to know myself more and more. And the more I was able to know who I was, then I was able to give myself more fully to God and to the church. And to be able to say to God, yes, I want to serve you. I love Jesus. I love the church. And I want to serve. I want to be a man of God, but I also know that many people are hungry for the truth that I'm coming to know as well. And I want to live my life devoted to being able to, in some way, share that truth and that joy that I was now experiencing in my own life.
Well, that's an important distinction, because a lot of people consider seminary to be sort of a vocational school. You learn the job
Correct.
of being a priest. Well, you have to hold your hands here at Mass, or,
Yes.
you know, you have to pray these prayers. But a lot of it is also becoming a different person, you know, really becoming the sort of person that this isn't a job I'm training for. It's a vocation. You know, just like marriage is not a job, well, you have to wash dishes or you have to wash the car or mow the lawn. You know, marriage is a life, and priesthood is a life, and seminary is supposed to open our eyes to understand it's not just the work.
Correct.
It's really the vocation, the life, really the foundation upon which we flow is that personal relationship with Jesus and wanting him to be known and loved by everybody.
Yes, absolutely. As I was going through the seminary, I guess maybe one of the early surprises was the fact that you really don't talk much. You really don't talk much about the work of being a priest. All of that comes much later in the formation process, but the focus really is on one's continued personal conversion. That really was the emphasis at St. Joseph's Seminary. Is how is God forming you, first of all, as a human being, you know, as a man. And what is your response to it? You know, as God is giving himself fully to you, how are you able to respond? Are you able to respond by saying, you know, God, I'm ready to give myself wholeheartedly to you? So really, seminary was that place and that opportunity that I had to say to God continually and over again, I am willing to give myself over to you. I mean, to me, it became clear that there was no greater gift than to do that. It was a great sense of peace. It gave me a great sense of peace, a great sense of joy as well, in knowing that God was entrusting to me something invaluable, and that was just simply God himself. And my response always wanted to be one that equaled that. You know, God is entrusting much to me, and so I want to entrust all of myself back to God. And in doing so, of course, entrusting myself to the church.
Well, I want to go backwards just a little bit, because people who watch this program know I often will talk about family life and how we are formed so early in our family life. You said that you're one of 9.
Correct.
Were there any other vocations that came from your family, either religious or priestly?
In my family, as among my brothers and sisters, there were not. They embraced the vocation of marriage.
Wholehearted.
And so, yeah, I am the only priest out of my 5 brothers, and then I have 3 sisters as well.
Now, in your family, you know, some of the families who might be watching the show today might have young children who are interested in holy things, church things. Maybe they play Mass, or maybe they cover themselves with veils. And what is it that you feel families can do to really help young people who do seem to have a spark of interest in holy things, in the life of the church? What do you think that families can be doing to really help foster that life of faith in the children?
Well, I'm a firm believer that it always begins in the family. And I was blessed to have parents who loved me unconditionally. And all of my brothers and sisters as well. We grew up in an environment where love was shared and experienced. And so for me, that was an experience of God, that I knew I was in a place where love was celebrated, where love was shared and given and received. And so for me, I think that was really the foundation of my call to respond in love to what God was asking. I think the role of the family, you know, when I was playing priest and playing, celebrating Mass, and my sisters would be dressed in their nightgowns, and I was flattening, the bread out with the saucer and drinking grape juice and reading my prayers from my children's prayer book. In some way, when I look back on it, my mom and dad never really made fun of it, and none of my brothers and sisters made fun of it, at least not in my face. They never did it to me. It was sort of like this was an ordinary experience for a young child. And so they never belittled it. No one ever did.
Good.
And so I think in some way they accepted it as a part of my childhood experience. And in doing so, I think they opened up the door for me to see that that it was something to be taken seriously. And so I think that knowing that this was a common experience and that it was something that wasn't belittled or made fun of or they didn't try to stop me, that helped to foster the fact that thinking about and praying about one's potential call is something that needs to be taken seriously. And so, for families who may have young children, who pretend maybe to be a priest or, a sister, that it should be taken seriously. And hopefully for the parents, they take that to prayer with them. That, Lord, thank you so much for the gift of this son or daughter. And we're just so grateful that you have given us the gift of life in them. And whatever it is, because it's their gifts from you to us, whatever it is that you want of them in life, hopefully this is their prayer, that they're open to it and that they'll know that we'll support them in whatever it is God may be asking of them.
Well, that's a good reminder for us to end on. We always end our show asking our audience to pray for vocations, to pray for young people to respond generously, to pray for priests and religious who are working in the diocese, and always to be asking the Holy Spirit to open our own hearts, to make us more willing to serve God, to make us more willing to serve the church, and to know that we are called to serve.